here we go. I'm here with Mr. Robert Nylen, who's the curator for the Nevada State Museum here in Carson City. Today is February the 12th, 2015. First off, I want to say thank you so much for the opportunity to talk with you.
I should thank you because I love this topic, so I enjoy sharing, so thank you.
So how long have you been the curator here at the Nevada State Museum?
Well, actually, this is a special time for me because I always have remembered my anniversary when I first started. So February the 15th will always be a special day. So I'm going to be finishing February 15th, 2015, 30 years and starting my 31st year. So I'm excited. I'm looking forward to even more things in the next, I don't know, I don't think I'll make it 30, but at least for another 10, I'm thinking of trying to stay and be the curator here.
That's neat. So our topic today is, of course, on minor league baseball and how it came into Nevada. So speaking of which, how did baseball come to Nevada?
Well, you know, I became interested in the topic when I was doing research in the historic newspapers around the state, and I got particularly interested because of the Carson City paper here, and talking about the development of a baseball team in the community back in 1869. And I had actually run across a couple mentions in 1868 of a team being developed out in Austin, but particularly the Carson City team intrigued me and made me very interested because two of the members who formed this, it was actually a baseball club, were newly hired Mint employees that were going to be working for the U.S. Mint that was going to open here in Carson City in 1870. But they had arrived early and the Mint wasn't ready yet to start full production. So in their off time, in the summer of that time period of 1869, they were out playing catch and hitting the ball out in what was called the plaza, which is where the site of the state capitol is today. It hadn't been built yet. And it just intrigued and excited a lot of the young men in the community. And I'm sure they asked them about the game, and so they decided on June 15th, 1869, to form a baseball club.
Oh, wow. Okay. So now I know, like, both here and in Virginia City, that they both had teams, but in Virginia City, how did they find level ground that much? Because isn't it pretty hilly there? Or?
Well, there was a spot as they got lower down in the community, down the hill, they found an area by the gas works, it was called, that they could find enough level, really ground, that they could really set up a field at that time. And it was interesting. We have an image that shows that particular field, and it's kind of an interesting shot because right around it you can see the mining dumps from the waste rock and ore that was thrown away that wasn't sent to the mills. And so there was enough space that they could lay out a field, and that's where they at least were able to challenge other communities. And this is where this first challenge match I contend it's the first state championship match between the two communities, Carson City, which was the state capital, and of course Virginia City, we have to always keep in mind, was the largest and was really the driving community of our state economically because of the huge mining up there, and the population was so much greater than any other community in our state at that era. And this would be 1869, 1870 time period we're talking about.
Okay. So now, was this the big rivalry between Carson City and the other team?
Well, I think it was when Carson developed their club, and Virginia City had at least this one club that played against the Carson team, and eventually Virginia City would have several clubs because there was a bigger population. But I think it just lent that once there was a team in Carson, that the tendency, or at least the way that these clubs would operate, is they would invite another club to play a match, a best 2 out of 3. And so that's what happened. Carson invited the Virginia City club to play a match, and they had the first game here in Carson to kick off the match in September of 1869. And it's fascinating, I think, how these clubs were organized. They would have a board of officials that would make it up, and then they would have their regular roster of active members or players. And it's interesting, later I came across a team, it was called the O'Shaughnessy's up in Virginia City a few years later in 1874. Now this was an interesting, again, showing the size of the community versus Carson City here. They had over 100 members, but only a certain number were active ball players. They had, again, their president and vice president, they had their board, but there were a lot of honorary members. And the interesting thing, the honorary members were made up of some of the most prominent names in Comstock history. William Sharon, John Mackey, and Alf Doughton was a famous newspaper man, and others. So it attracted, in this case, which was the largest club I've ever come across, most of them averaged about 25 members, more so like the Carson one. They were pretty much all players, though they did have a few honorary or supportive members. And interesting enough, so you had your core players, and that's what, when the challenge was made, they set up the first match here, and Carson won. Just, in those days, when I give the amount of what the score was, 81-31, people go, that's a baseball score? But you have to realize the way the game was played at that time was different. The field positions, they stayed at their bases, they pitched the ball underhand. It was a hard ball, so you weren't necessarily able to get in front of it and catch it like we do with gloves today. So that all added up to an exciting game. Carson won very easily. One thing to back up to mention was, as I mentioned, this was an invitation. It was very sportsmanlike oriented. You invited the other club to come to your field to play. The Virginia City baseball team came down in a stagecoach. There wasn't, the V&T hadn't been completed, so they came down in the stagecoach, and the first thing that they did that was set up for them was to have breakfast and get a tour of the state prison before they came into town, which I always got a chuckle out of that. They did that, and then once they got to Carson, again, they were met by the Carson Silver Stars baseball team, and they were given these, like a red ribbon or something to notify that they were a visiting team coming in from Virginia City. And before the game started at around 1 o'clock, they were basically given the keys to Carson City. They could have any amount of drink they wanted or any amount of food. They could check out horses to ride. I mean, it was great strategy when you think of it. By the time the game probably started, they were probably pretty tired and pretty full of food and drink. And so they set it up, and the first game was played. And I would like to see, to get maybe one of the last things in the next 10 years that I can get done, I'd like to see a marker out on the Capitol grounds to note that first really baseball game that I think was between two communities, where you had this match developed, and they had it on the Capitol grounds. As I mentioned, the Capitol wasn't completed, so they had a nice level, great field really. And prior to the game, the members of the Carson Silver Stars went out and cleaned the field. They actually had dues that members paid, very, 50, not even 50 cents, I was thinking it was 10 or 20 cents that they would contribute. That was used for things like that, to maintain the field. And the day of the game, they had set up a special section just for women to come and watch the game. And so it would have been so exciting. And so I've got my hopes that someday somebody took a picture of just the assembly of the crowd for that special game. So far, nothing has turned up, but in history, you never know. We're always being approached with things that we didn't think would still exist, and yet they're out there and people have them, and they could be anywhere in the country. We've even had things come back from Maine and other parts of the country where relatives had once lived here and then moved away.
Wow. Were there any big stakes at the game? I mean, in the sense of, was there any betting, or did somebody win something?
That's a good point that you brought that up. At that game, I did not see anything, but at other games in Nevada in those earlier years, there were things for bets. Sometimes they would play for a bat or ball as a symbol of winning the game, and then sometimes they even played for beer, which made sense after after playing in the hot weather in the summer, the winning team got the barrel of beer. And one of the most interesting, here's another thing that I think is interesting, that I tried to turn it into a thing that we could tie into today. There was a gentleman here, he was a businessman. I don't have a lot of information on him at this point, and maybe some more will turn up. His name was Fred Brooks, and he ran a bookstore, and he came up with an award. It was after this initial series between Carson and Virginia City. He came up with an award, it was called the Brooks Silver Bat. And it was mounted on some kind of a piece of wood, and it was a silver bat. And he displayed it in his store window, and it was actually given to the winning team between a game between Carson City and Virginia City. And my thought was, because I think they still do, we have the University of Nevada plays UNLV, and back in 1989 for the 125th anniversary, I approached the commission at that time about sponsoring this trophy. Bring it back, bring a really authentic thing. We could redesign it, there was no pictures of it, but I even came up with a design, and it didn't fly. But those were kinds of things. And then there were times when they bet on games too with actual money. But there was this special trophy. Whatever happened to it, I don't know how much longer. Mr. Brooks was only here for a short time. And what made him do that? Obviously, he was a passionate fan even early on in this time period. This was like a year or two after that game in 1869. So we're talking about 1870, 1871.
Wow. How important was baseball to the community? And did this help a lot with civic pride?
Oh, I think civic pride it really did. It seemed like a natural, and people in the communities just went right to it, where the Carson City had this great turnout from the public, and actually one of the great fans of Carson City's baseball at that time was Abe Curry, the founder of Carson City back in 1858, and also he's so connected with the history of the U.S. Mint here in Carson City. He was the first director, and he followed the team closely. We know that from the newspaper. When they went to California, he would respond to telegraph messages of how the team was doing. And so we know that it really worked perfectly to give community pride, community support for the teams. And I think it was true up in Virginia City. There was a great turnout for when the Carson City team went up there for the second game of that match. This time Carson won it, so they won 2 out of 3 immediately. They won 54-16. They still dominated the Virginia City team. And what I always love, I'm kind of diverting here, but it's kind of came to my mind, is that one thing I loved about baseball, maybe not, they do it to some degree today, but back then, even early on, the Carson City, when they won easily the 2 games, particularly the game down here, they won pretty handily, that the Virginia City newspaper said, oh, the reason they won was it's because the air is not as rarefied down here, so our team's ball wouldn't go as far, or our team had too tight of pants on. You know, they always had some kind of excuse, whereas Carson obviously was the superior team. But I think baseball just fit right into this thing of supporting your community, and I see that later when we get teams, as it expands, when you have teams down, particularly after the 20th century, when you have teams in Tonopah and Goldfield playing other mining communities. And aside to this, I think also you see within a community, if it was big enough and there were teams, you could have teams that were related to like an occupation. You'd have the painters versus the carpenters. And so you could have pride within your own profession as a worker, as well as community. But I think you saw it on a wide basis on the communities when they played each other, and it kicked right off right from that beginning 1869 game.
Was there a lot of marketing strategy for local businesses? Like, I mean, did they have names on the back of their shirts and stuff like that back then?
You know, one thing I've noticed is it's just on these early games, there's not, as I mentioned, there isn't really at this point, we don't have photographs to show us what the uniforms look like. I think the connection was, I know, for example, with the Carson City team, there was a local saloon here that supported them. And I think that might have been the connection, is they provided space for the team to play upstairs. And maybe it is like when I was growing up, I remember some of these softball teams would be sponsored by a business. I don't think that the uniforms, because we don't have any photographs showing any of these early uniforms. indeed, what did they wear? I wish we did. It's hard to tell. They were available. They could have acquired them, but there's no evidence to tell me that they did. They might have just made some makeshift things and passed it as uniforms. We're not sure. But to answer your question, I think it was more maybe a one business that would provide them space and provide them that kind of support to hold their meetings, would be like a sponsoring business in the community.
Okay. When they traveled, this is the time of the telegraph.
Right.
So did they telegraph, like, the guy hit the ball, or that, there was 2 strikes on the batter, or was there a play-by-play?
No, not that I know of. It was more, what was the final score? How did they do? It wasn't like maybe later when we've seen some movies and things where they would have an actual people sitting down and they'd follow, and they'd even have a diagram of a field up there and have move players around and things like that. As far as I know, the telegraph provided the ability to know how the team did. They didn't really provide anything more than the score at that time.
Okay.
But it's interesting to note, though, I think that once the game was over, the telegraph provided the means for the newspapers to provide some coverage of what happened during the game. So it wasn't immediately, but for the next day's paper, they could put information on, this is what the score was, and maybe how some of the local players did in the game.
As this was baseball basically a source for exercise for the society that was becoming increasingly sedimentary with industrialization, mechanization, encroaching urbanization, and maternity?
That's a great question. I don't know if I can really answer it, but I think from what I know about the thing, it seemed like it gave people a release. I think the ability of these young men to play, it gave them a bond to play in a game that they could have fun in and also have this club atmosphere. I don't know how they thought about exercise at that time. A lot of positions, men worked very hard. They were long work hours. I think it was more of maybe a release from the monotony of working jobs, longer hours than we do today, and that maybe the exercise element maybe didn't play as much because we know of it's a very strange team that was formed out in a community called Hamilton, out in White Pine County, and it was called the Fat Man's Club, of a baseball club that they supposedly formed out there. They listed all the weights of all the players, and they were all very stout, big men, and they claimed they were the heaviest baseball team on the West Coast. Obviously, it sounds like they weren't so much in playing the game, and I don't think I was ever able to find a mention of them playing. I think they were more the type of a club that liked together and have the drink and the food element and the camaraderie of the different players in the club. So, good question, but I don't know if I have the answer to that one on the exercise element of it.
Okay. Was there a group of critics, though, that were concerned about the spectator sports, such as baseball? I mean, people just, they worried about people watching instead of doing stuff?
I didn't get a feel for that in the newspapers around, the ones that I've looked at in northern Nevada in those early years. I think it was something new. It was something where spectators could come out and watch their community and cheer on, I assume. I've seen some pictures a little bit later in 1900 in Dayton, Nevada, which is a smaller milling community that did a lot of the milling of the ore from the Comstock along the Carson River. And there's a great series of photographs that show a baseball game. And you see, it's not a huge crowd, nothing like was mentioned in this earlier game where you had a much bigger turnout, but yet enough of a turnout, and you could actually see kids jumping up and down, the excitement of a player getting a good hit or making a good play. So I don't know if there was early on, if there was this question about, the crowd. I think it was something that people were attracted to. And another thing that was associated with the American West was the rock drilling contest, where they actually had miners that would they did the double jack, where one miner would hold a drill and they would use the other one would hit with the sledgehammer, and they could see how fast they could drill down in a block of granite very hard. And you'd see huge crowds there to watch those events. So I think it was, again, in that case, it was a team of not necessarily local men, sometimes it was local, but they were well-known members of these incredible teams that could do this drilling. So it attracted large crowds too. So I think there was a need, an interest in just as with sports, because it was like a type of sports like baseball, to come out and cheer people on or cheer on your local community, your baseball team on.
Okay, thank you. You had mentioned that there was a letter to the editor in the Reno paper in the early days, questioning why such towns like Carson City, Virginia City, Dayton all had baseball teams, but Reno didn't. Why was that?
I think that they were caught when the Reno papers noticed this match between Virginia City and Carson, and the excitement it created, and the knowing about picking up, because these newspaper editors of that time got copies of the other papers. They were always reporting about what was happening in the state, and when they saw that Virginia City and Carson had a team and nothing had been formed then in Reno, that's when he made this statement, how can Virginia City, particularly he pointed out, how can Virginia City have a team when they don't even, it's hard to find 10 feet of level ground up there. So it was kind of a funny thing, and I think he was kind of sending a little message to the younger men in the community. Let's get out there, let's form a team, let's have community pride and play one of these teams. Maybe have a match game against them, just like they created, and get the community involved in promoting Reno.
There are a few photos that show women also playing baseball. Was that very common, or was that very unique in the Wild West and being on the frontier?
Well, I would have to say I've just seen a couple of pictures, and it looked like more they were just doing it just to get the experience, to have the fun, not being on any official team that I know of, but just maybe a brother, one of their brothers was on a team. And I remember, I think it's the picture that I think of out in Tuscarora. It's a mining community that was located out in Elko, Nevada, the county out there. And it shows a woman who's taken a pretty hefty swing. So I think they were interested in maybe participating, but as far as I know, I never come across a mention of actually playing in a game in these earlier years. But I think they were attracted too, like others, to the game itself, and probably wished maybe they were limited because of that era, not allowed to take part in it.
I've been told that long before Jackie Robinson integrated professional baseball in the West, that it was not heard of for different nationality and different races to play baseball together. Was it even thought about, or was it just something that was done, that different races?
I think because Nevada has such a tradition or such a history, as it was a state that attracted for many years, had the highest percentage of immigrants that came to this state in the 19th century. And I think that when they went to put together these teams, they were put together not because you were one ethnic group or another, because of the love of the game, to play baseball, to be part of the club, they were allowed to become members. And if they could play and learn how to play, and in some cases maybe they had played back east and maybe they were knowledgeable about the game or had played it before, it was natural as they would immigrate in here to Nevada. After the turn of the century, I do see in a junior league team out in Elko, and this was in the McGill area, excuse me, I shouldn't say Elko, it was out in White Pine County in McGill. There was an African-American boy, he was a teenager, that was part of the team. He has a uniform. So they allowed him, and McGill was a real company town. It was a milling town out there, and this would be around the 1910 time period. But we also see at that time there was an African American Pullman team. Pullman was associated with the railroad sleeping cars, and they had in Tonopah, they had their team, but it was all African Americans, and they played games in Tonopah and there was a lot of community pride about the African American team. So we see examples where an African American boy was allowed to play on one of the youth teams in McGill, and where there was a group enough, there was enough Pullman porters and such in Tonopah when they would have a stop there. Tonopah, again, keeping it in context, was a major mining community of that era of 1900, after the turn of the century, so that they competed against white teams that were playing out of the Tonopah area.
Now, I know that Satchel Paige played here in Reno, as well as Walter Johnson. Can you tell me anything about that?
Well, I'm much more familiar with Walter Johnson. I need to do, once in your question about Satchel Paige, I need to do more research on that. But I can speak to Walter Johnson, and I'm very interested in him. He was, he's one of the 5 immortals of baseball. He was one of the 5 first inductees into the National Hall of Fame in 1935 with the others, like when we think of Babe Ruth and Ty Cobb and that. And it just so happens that Walter Johnson was married to the daughter of a prominent politician of that era in Nevada. His name was E. Roberts. His daughter Hazel, when E. Roberts was elected to be our representative, we only had one at that time, to Congress, she met Walter Johnson when he was playing for the Washington Nationals. They fell in love, they were married, and then there was this real connection with Reno, because later E. Roberts was the long-serving, kind of a controversial, a very colorful mayor of Reno for a number of years, and his son-in-law was Walter Johnson. So in the 1920s, there was a lot of talk how he would come in the off-season to spend time with his in-laws here and with his wife Hazel and their family. And he would love to go out hunting with E. Roberts and some of E. Roberts' friends that he got to know quite well. They would go to Spanish Springs, and there was nothing out there like we know today. It was an area where you could go duck hunting and other kinds of hunting. And the interesting thing was, when I think of Walter Johnson, was that 1924 World Series, the Washington Nationals, after so many years where they were a second place ball club or second division ball club, they finally put it all together. And Walter Johnson, his nickname was the Big Train. He used to always carry his teammates. He was an amazing pitcher. I think he had 113 shutouts, 56 innings of scoreless ball, and many other high statistics as a pitcher. And finally, they put it all together. They beat the New York Yankees by 2 games, and he was going to be in the World Series. So Reno was very excited about the fact that they considered Walter their hometown boy, because even though he wasn't born here, he spent a lot of the off season here. They even sent a representative. His name was Reverend Brewster Adams, a friend of Walter Johnson and a friend of the Roberts family, E. Roberts. And he went back to represent the city at the World Series, in that great series between the Washington Nationals and the New York Giants, which was really one of John McGraw, the famous manager, one of the great teams of that era. And to mention, Walter pitched the first game and he didn't win. It was a close game. And it got down to the second time he pitched again, he didn't win. And so it came to a 7th game. And sure enough, it was a close game. It was tied, and late in the game, Bucky Harris was the manager. He was a player manager. He played shortstop, and he walked out to the mound. Who do you think they were going to put the ball in the hand of? Walter Johnson. He brought him in. He held the Giants scoreless, and they scored a run, and they won the World Series in 7 games, 4-3. And Reno, just in the newspapers, you could just see the excitement. And immediately they made plans to have a Walter Johnson Day to celebrate his victory. The people all felt like it was part of Reno's, their favorite son winning. So they had a special day at in the downtown. They had speeches. Walter Johnson was very modest. He didn't really say very much, but he was very honored that day. He threw some balls around to show the kids and enjoyed talking to them. They actually gave him a shotgun that was specially engraved. I assume the family still has that, of the Johnson family to this day. And he brought a couple of his teammates with him, and they were just treated, and it was a special, special day in Reno's history. And Hazel, his wife, was very active too. She wrote a column that was a national syndicated column about what was it like for a wife to watch her husband and the Washington Nationals play in this first time they had been in the World Series. And so it was pretty special. And I've always wondered if I could ever find that shotgun. And his grandson, Henry Thomas is his name, did a wonderful biography on his grandfather, Walter Johnson. So I never did have a chance to contact him, but I figured if anybody would know where that special rifle was, maybe he had it. And I had thought maybe of seeing if we could borrow it to display it, with connection. If one of my dreams has always been to do a baseball exhibit at the State Museum here and have it travel, because I think it would be a natural. Everyone enjoys baseball, and I think people would be surprised about the early history and origins, but also this one connection with one of the immortals of baseball, Walter Johnson.
That'd be so neat. Going back a little bit, when Carson played Virginia City, did they have like a medal or like an all-star medal or anything like that?
Not that I know of. There wasn't anything. I think it was again this invitation. You made a challenge, or you asked another team to come and play. They treated them, as I mentioned, they gave them special ribbons and gave them tours and gave them all kinds of special, ability to have all the food they wanted, any drink, to ride horses, do anything. It was like an invitation to come to the community and then to be introduced to the community. And the community was, it was a way for the community to say, we appreciate you coming to play this game, and the good sportsmanship, and to just enjoy treating them and as host that particular day. And it was returned when the Carson team went to Virginia City. They were taken out to a fine restaurant up there, and I'm sure some of the other same gracious gifts and abilities to tour the town and all that before the game.
Will you tell me a little bit about Jack Thrillkill, his team, the Reno Garage, and whatever happened to all that?
I was going to do some checking on that. I just didn't have a chance before I got here. So I would be totally making something up. My strength has been more in the earlier years, though I have to say, since you asked me to be interviewed, I'm really excited. I was doing some research last night in the Reno papers. And that's the thing, if I can mention, when I started this interest in baseball in the 1980s, after I got hired here, it wasn't as easy to do research. Now at home with the computer, the internet, I can call up the Reno papers, or I can go to the census to look up information. Prior to that, I had to go to the state library or Carson or the Historical Society. So it's helped a lot. So it's reinvigorated me to do some research and look into the history of things that maybe I didn't take the time to look at earlier.
What is the story about the AAA All-Star medallion that was made here in Carson, right?
Right, it was made here at the Carson City Mint, which is part of the Nevada State Museum. And that's the original press that was here in 1870. It was here at the time of that baseball game. When we talked about the game that took place for the championship between Virginia City and Carson City, it was here. It wasn't in operation yet, but just shortly in 1870, it went on to have a tremendous career for the U.S. Mint. It was used at this mint. It was the first and only press here for the first 5 years. And then eventually, After this mint closed down in 1893, it was shipped back to Philadelphia, and then it was in Philadelphia until 1945, and then at that time, they needed that press out here in the West again, so it was shipped out to San Francisco, the U.S. Mint there. And by the 1950s, it was one of the older presses because it was originally built back in 1868, about a year before that first baseball game was played in 1869. And they were going to scrap it. They were going to destroy it. So the museum was able to save it for $250, and it was brought back here. And we used it to do commemorative silver dollars. And so when that AAA baseball game was going to be held, the All-Star game, a real special thing for Reno, it's going to be a number of years before we get another All-Star game here. I was approached by the general manager, and we started putting it all together. He had this idea about doing a medallion. He had heard about us doing special medallions. These are 1 ounce, .999 fine silver medallions that are minted off the historic coin press, one of the, as I mentioned, the original press here. And so working with him, Rick Parr, it was a great joy. I had a lot of fun working with Rick, and we put it all together. We made a very limited run because it was only for the players, the ones that were the All-Stars, for management from the different All-Star, from the different AAA teams, and probably a few other officials. So I think the total mintage came to only less than 250 of those. So not very many. We minted them about 2 weeks before the game, and Rick Parr and some other officials from the Reno Aces came by since they were the host team, and we came up with a special holder that the medallion is placed within a card holder with an envelope, and then those were passed out. I think on the Friday they had like a luncheon, and I wasn't able to attend, but I think that's when Rick Parr and the Reno Aces gave those to those players. So it was something special, and when we got ready to mint that day, it was a Friday, 2 weeks before the game, I told my story about the fact of the 2 mint employees bringing baseball to Carson City, starting a team, and about how this really had a connection with the press there. So it was kind of comes back full circle to this building being involved with that big first championship game between Virginia City and Carson City. So I was very proud of that and very pleased that we were able to work with the Reno Aces to make that happen.
Tell me about the reproduction of the Carson City Silver Stars uniform. How'd you?
You know, that was a great thing too. That was another thing I was very proud of. It just so happens, this was back around in the early 1990s. There was a celebration of concerning Carson City's history, and somebody, or I don't know if I proposed it or somebody said, well, how about if we did a reenactment of that first game between Virginia City and Carson City? And I said, sure, that would be great. So we decided that. Since I did the research, I was the umpire. I got 2 teams put together, one for Carson City and one for Virginia City. We laid out the field, and I decided to get a replica uniform made. And basically, I went back to the books and illustrations of that era, and you can see teams of that era that already had uniforms, as well as at the same time you had the first professional baseball team is the Cincinnati Red Stockings, and that was 1869, and you could look at what their uniforms looked like, but there were also other teams, other club teams around the country of that same era and some of what their uniforms. So I modeled it off that. I found a woman who was a professional seamstress. I showed her the uniform and pictures, and she designed it. And I was able to, the only thing she did the basic uniform. And then even at that time, and this was late 1980s, early 1990s, you had reenactment teams, and there was a great market. I think there still is today. You can actually buy era hats from different periods of baseball history. And I went and I found a company back, I think it was in Louisville, which makes sense where the Louisville Bats were made, Louisville Sluggers, and it was also the same company. He also made replica balls, and I was able to get 2 balls from him, and I got the hat for the uniform. So that day when we had the game, we had one of my friends dress up in the uniform to bring back the era of that time period, the 1869's uniform, as closely as I could interpret that they would have worn maybe. And the ball was interesting. The ball was a replica. So it wasn't like the ball that they used in that 1869 game. It wasn't like a regular hard ball. It was actually softer. But still, in that game, it was a really exciting game too, and I was the umpire. I had to fine a couple of the players because they used some strong language. I fined them 10 cents to keep them in line. And it's very different, before I tell you about this one play, actually 2 plays, it's very different as the umpire is not like today and stands right behind with his equipment on. The umpire would stand over to the right of the batter when it wasn't a home plate, it was a round disc, and they called it the striker zone, And the catchers in that era also, they were farther back. They weren't right up on today, and they didn't use catcher's matches at that era of 1869. Eventually they would add those, but they would be farther back to, again, retrieve the ball, throw it back to the pitcher. But they were during that time, the era, there were some daring catchers who got really close and tried to catch the foul tips, but sometimes that could backfire. They get smacked right in the face with the ball. But my point was, even with this replica ball, we had a tremendous game, and we laid the field out just like from the diagrams of that era. And there was this one play, and we played at Mills Park, which is a short distance from here. We couldn't play on the Capitol grounds because there was just too many trees today and different situation. But we used Mills Park, a short distance from here. And interestingly enough, one left-handed hitter for the Carson City team just smacked the ball. And I felt like, if you know a little bit, Mills Park borders on US 50, one of the major highways that comes into Carson. And when he hit it, I thought he was going to hit it over the highway. He hit it that hard, but because it wasn't a regular hard ball, it kind of just died out in the outfield and the guy caught it. And the other interesting thing, the other thing I remember from that game that sticks in my mind, we had a triple play. The Virginia City team pulled a triple play, and the final score of that game, if I could tell you, Virginia City avenged that loss back from 1869. They won 1-0. That was the difference in the game with that ball. And I think it was one of the most fun things I did. And the great thing was, I couldn't believe it. We asked Governor Miller at that time to play for the Carson team, and he was a great sport. He came out and played. He was a catcher. I've got a picture of him as the catcher for the Reno team and played in that game.
Wow.
Yeah.
Did you just get regular people to play, or how did you get individuals to be on both sides?
Well, it was interesting. A number of our staff at that time, the males we were a younger staff back in 1990, and so 3 or 4 of our staff members played. And then I got to know of a couple of other people that were former baseball players who had played for, one of them had played for UNR as a baseball player on their college team, and he got the rest of the team for the Reno team. And then for the Virginia City team, I happened to know his name was Dave Moore, who was the editor for the Nevada magazine. And he was from the Comstock area, and he got a whole bunch of players from the Virginia City, Silver City, and Dayton area to make up their team. And so it was great. We actually have pictures of the 2 teams. We actually had the Reno team, I got them hats, and they had the blue. Reno, Carson's always been, even to this day, the Carson Senators are blue here. And the Virginia City team, we just interpreted and gave them red hats. But it was so much fun. You can see how I get enthusiastic about that day because the weather was beautiful. We actually played the game in, I think it was late February, so we could have had snow and it was terrible. But it was almost like we have now. We've had really this warm weather, and it was just spectacular weather. And we had a great crowd out there. I think a lot of people had a lot of fun. I had a lot of fun being the umpire. And you know, at that time, the other reason you had such high scores is the pitching was done a shorter distance. It was 45 feet. It isn't the full distance that we have today. And they threw underhanded. And the thing was, the pitcher, the sportsmanship again at this time was you were supposed to, and actually I read sometimes that the batters would actually tell the pitcher, you know, put it right here for me. So you were duly to do that as a sportsman to provide them. You weren't any trickery. But it's interesting, shortly after, you know, this game that I mentioned, you have reports even in Nevada where, you know, the pitcher was putting some spin on it and different, you know, ways to get an advantage. So it didn't last too long that the batters were supposed to get the perfect, you know, pitch from the pitcher. And I had to fine a couple batters. I had to give a warning, I should say. I didn't fine him, but I warned the pitcher that, you know, he wasn't supposed to put any spin on it, just give it to the batters. So that was part of my job as the umpire too, to do that.
Wow. Coming a little bit forward, Reno has had a lot of teams and they just didn't make it. Why have not earlier teams in Reno made it like the Reno Aces have right now?
You know, that's a great question. I remember when I was first visited, the first time I ever came to Nevada was in 1962. And my sister had married a local native of Nevada, Bill Douglas, who went on to have a very distinguished career at the university. And we were visiting for 2 weeks, and he took us to see a Reno Silver Sox game when they were the affiliate of the Dodgers at that time. And it was a great game, I remember. And we went to Moana Stadium, and I think, if I remember, they won the game on a massive home run because it had a huge center field. And the batter, who I thought of going back in the papers to find out who the guy was that hit, I remember I was 10 years old at the time, seeing the ball go over the left center field, which was quite a poke in that park. And they won the game that day. But to answer your question, I wonder if it's because we have the difference between these were lower, they weren't AAA teams like we have the Reno Aces. They were, in this case, I think the beginning levels for the Dodgers and that at that point. And maybe the size of the community too. You have to remember, Reno, though, until 1960, in the 50s, was the largest community, at least in 1950. It was bigger than Las Vegas at that time. But by 1960, there was a whole different dynamics as the shift in the development of the gaming industry. And Reno hadn't really developed to a much larger size. So I wonder if one was the population. At the time, there wasn't enough to kind of generate enough of the population to go to the games. I think when you see the Aces coming in, you have AAA, you're one step away from the majors. You also have this park built in the downtown. I think that was a real plus for making the team a success. And I think just the marketing, you see so much activity on the part of the Aces. I mentioned Rick Parr and others that promote all kinds of ways to make the team part of the community. I'm not sure, I'd have to do more research on the Silver Sox, and then they were, as you'll see, we have a uniform from the Silver Sox, but we also have one from when they were the Padres for a period, when they were the affiliated of the Padres, and then there was the Reno Diamonds and Chuckers. I've never got a uniform for those two later, but I just think it was maybe at the different level of the baseball, and then the commitment also, I think, was much greater by the community, by the city fathers, of making that park part of redevelopment of the downtown. That has played a big part of it too. I have to say, though, if I could add, I really did enjoy Moana Park. I used to take my son when he was growing up many, many times to see the Silver Sox. I really enjoyed it. Many memorable times going out there and seeing, and it was used by other things. I did see a couple of divisional, I think state division for the Northern Championship where you'd have Carson playing. I think it was McQueen one year. So it was used for that too, besides just for the teams like Reno, the Reno Silver Sox, to use that field.
Why did Nylen go down so badly? I mean, why was it just kind of left under?
You know, that's a good question. Sadly, I don't know the answer to that. I thought that it was a great park, but maybe once this modern ballpark, the Aces Park, was built, it was pretty hard to justify to rehabilitate, put money into that. I guess I don't get to Reno as much, and maybe you can confirm this. I guess they've turned that site into many soccer fields now, and I guess their focus was to meet that need as a change in our community as soccer has grown and changed so much. When I was growing up, we didn't have soccer. We didn't have soccer leagues and all that. So there's a difference there. I miss the park. I'm glad I think they've marked it with a memorial or a marker. I would hope they have, because it did give some excitement and interest to the history of our community for a number of years until it was taken down.
Well, thank you so much. We are done with this portion, so I appreciate it. I look forward to looking at your uniforms and things like that as well.
And if I could just say, I want to thank you for getting me, again, excited about a topic that sometimes when you work in history, you start off and then you get to, move on to other things. And I think there's so much more that could be done on it. And I think one thing that's easier now with the internet and things all of the different resources. And you asked one great question about, we know how the Carson City team developed, but I'd like to be able to look at other communities, like for example, Virginia City a little bit closer. It had more teams, bigger population, and look and see about what were some of the occupation of some of the players of the team. So it's gotten me reinvigorated and excited about the topic again. And also as the curator of history, to go out, and I'm going to make a call to Rick Parr and see if we can't get an Aces uniform to be part of our collections to go with these other ones.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. He's the man to go to.